Very pleased to reintroduce you to Andy, who, well, you don't need more details, but is a great friend of mine, I'm very proud to say. He writes about all manner of things, great essays and books indeed, about missing persons, about war, politics, fashion, the press, Jimmy Savile he's written about not so long ago, and the trappings of fame. You've heard that he's the author of numerous novels, 5 novels, 2 works of non-fiction, and many awards. But I want to say a little bit about how he writes, not just what he writes about. There are a couple of things I've heard you say recently that made me think of your own writing. One is that the world is vastly underdescribed, and the other is to do with beauty of thought. That's not something that is much introduced in journalism these days, but it's something that is very particular to the way Andy writes. I mean, he's an incredible investigator, you'll see from this book, like an old-fashioned gumshoe or detective, incredibly good at marshalling the information he gathers also, which is rare. But as well as that, I think there are some incredibly elegant, frightening, if anything, ideas in this book that will alter your mind, perhaps, even without the need for some of the illegal drugs available on the internet, which there are also some instructions about in here. So please do read it. I know you each have a copy. We'll talk a little bit about it. First, there are 3 essays in the book, originally written for the London Review of Books, very long pieces, 2 very long pieces. One about Julian Assange, as you heard, one about Craig Wright, also known as Satoshi Nakamoto, who is the founder of the cybercurrency Bitcoin, and one about the possibilities of inventing a self over the internet. And Andrew will talk a little bit about that. I mean, can you... just to begin with, these are linked pieces. Can you talk a little bit about how they evolved from each other or how they were conceived at the start?
Funnily enough, the one that wasn't part of an invitation, I was invited by Julian Assange and his representatives to help him write his memoir. That's a whole story in itself. And I was approached by Craig Wright, the purported inventor of Bitcoin, much later, is not to help him write a book, but to be the subject of a book that I might write. So those 2 were, as it were, offered up to me. I suppose offered up not innocently, because I had already established an interest in questions of selfhood and disappearance in the age of the internet. The middle story, though, was what really started them. I'd been carrying in my head for quite a long time, I think for possibly 12 or 13 years, a notion that I would like to write a non-fiction, extended non-fiction piece where I took the name of a dead child and fashioned a life based on that name, doing effectively what the Metropolitan Police had famously or infamously done in London for many years, which was to build legends around these names they'd found in graveyards. And they're using those names, those legends, those false identities. They would infiltrate left-wing groups around the country. And they went a bit far, some of those officers, in the sense that they lived a wholly second life, married people, had children in their second life, whilst going home, if you like, to their first identity. So I was interested in all of that, and I felt that that story, if I could write it, would tell you something about a way of having a self, multiple selves possibly, in the age of the internet. And that really was gestating and growing in me for a long time, even before I began the Assange project. But once I wrote the Assange story, I knew that it was inevitable I would write the life of Ronnie Pinn, this story about an invented identity. And that led, because Bitcoin comes up in that story, I was alert to Bitcoin when I'd finished the Ronnie Pinn, and it was at that point that these Los Angeles lawyers contacted me with the idea that I might be furnished with all the details about this man, Craig Wright, who claimed to be Satoshi Nakamoto.
And that was just a coincidence. I mean, you were using Bitcoin currency in order to buy things on the internet as Ronnie Pinn,
yes.
But then they approached you, they had no idea you'd been doing that. Oh.
No, they didn't. I mean, they felt from reading novels of mine and non-fiction pieces that I might be the right person for the job. I'm always a bit curious as to why they think I'm the right person for those jobs, because I have to say, especially here in the environs at Google, I mean, I'm not a natural techie, I'm not ultra experienced in these matters. I had to really make a journey. You often do, as you know, as a writer of fiction and non-fiction. You sort of disappear into the world beyond your ignorance if you know what I mean. You start off, often the best position, in fact, to be starting off is to know very little. I knew very little about cryptocurrency when I met Craig Wright. By the end, I think, I'd been living with it for the best part of a year and was inside the whole eccentric sort of worlds within worlds that exist. I'm sure many of the listeners will know about that world. And it's very strange. It's almost like a simulacrum of a society, a sort of society gone slightly wrong, I would argue.
Yeah.
It's unstable, and they're very unstable about each other. It's not a natural, harmonious world of learning and investigation, the world of computer science. Sometimes, certainly when it came to Craig Wright and the question of Satoshi, it was a giant sort of school playground, really.
Yeah, well, Google comes up in that story, doesn't it? Because there's a suggestion, there's a very interesting distinction between the currency and the idea for the currency. You know, could he be prosecuted, for instance? You know, if guns were bought with his, excuse me, his currency, which you do as Ronnie Pinn, incidentally, then could he be prosecuted? But in fact, what was suggested was that what could be sold was the intellectual property, right, which was the idea behind it, and perhaps that would be sold even to Google. I mean, the lawyer has an idea about.
Well, the men in black, as I call them, which was the two, the one from Vancouver and the other man from Australia, who were joining forces to repackage the purported Satoshi's patents and sell them to, as it were, Google. It was certainly in the frame at one point. And being shown this material, and the figures were very high because you were talking about pretty advanced and quite excellent patents moving towards AI and developments linking the blockchain to developments in artificial intelligence in a way that was pretty pucka and certainly fresh. And those patents, many of them have been established, are registered anyway. And so there was big money being suggested, and the murkiness of of Craig Wright's world and his tax affairs and the question of prosecutions, which I have to say I always thought were ludicrous. I mean, to prosecute the people who administer cryptocurrency because it's used for illicit purposes would be a bit like, prosecuting the Bank of England because there was a suitcase of tenors found at King's Cross that were going to be used to buy drugs. I mean, it's ludicrous. The currency is just a thing.
Well, but it's indicative of the fear. People don't really know what this is. How would the law respond to something so new? Or
I think there's a lot of fear in that way. I mean, I get a lot of correspondence and a lot of questions coming from people who they're frightened of cryptocurrency. I mean, people who have mortgages, that's to say most people who have mortgages and who have pensions and who pay into funds of various sorts and insurances, they worry that the thing they've been doing all their life is, as it were, bogus or meaningless. And of course it is. And that's very hard to take if you've been paying into a pension for 40 years and suddenly to realise that it's just a kind of a piece of mathematics. And so one of the things that cryptocurrency does, I think, is that it makes that absolutely explicit. When you get into talking about currency and you realise that in certain parts of civilization in the past, people used shells or they used feathers or we used pieces of paper with the Queen's face stamped on them. It's all ludicrous. It's as ludicrous or no less so than lines of code, you might argue. But lines of code, which of course is what all our bank accounts are now, cause people to have a nervous breakdown as opposed to a suitcase of tenors, which seems to mean something. I mean,
because
a child's eyes would widen if you handed them a bunch of £50 notes. But if you said, "Oh, I've just installed on your computer, 20 Bitcoin," they might go, "Well, show me what I can do with that." But increasingly, of course,
although
generation younger, they're much
more
more
likely
into. If you just need to check today's value of one Bitcoin, and they know that you were enriching them. But I mean, obviously, for those of us who grew up before digital currency, we have trouble, and some people are frightened of it, but I don't see why. Now that I've worked with it, I think it's wholly logical.
But it is actually sort of one of these ideas that shows you what you've been living with all along, I suppose.
Yeah, it sort of turns it up to the light that it's always been a sort of invented thing. Money's a bit of and the question
mirage.
of value isn't an actual real, touchable thing in the way that I think we imagine it is. When we see a stack of paper in our wallet, we think, well, that's what I'm worth.
Yeah.
You know, the question of what you're worth is actually behind all this.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's why we're coming to the idea of being human. But do you want to talk a little bit about Assange, you know, how you found him to be in the first place? I'm sure you're very interested at how he was. I mean, right at the beginning, you seem to have been quite convinced that he was a courageous person, regardless of how he was in his habits.
I was very struck by the position he was in when I first met him. That's to say, a man wearing an electronic ankle bracelet, effectively under house arrest, in Ellingham Hall, a large country house outside Bungay, of all places, in Norfolk. And I was invited there to come and meet him, and I had followed the WikiLeaks case, if you like, pretty much from the beginning. Fascinated by the work they were doing. Have always been fascinated by both individuals and institutions and publications that speak truth to power in that way and seek to undermine the secret bonds that can exist between governments and the media, or the media and certain individuals in society, or big money issues and causes, and the flow of information. The relationship between marketing and publicity and morality has always interested me. So I thought, there it is. There's an organisation finally that is not allowing any of these relationships to be taken for granted. And the Afghan war logs made it clear that there had been a rather corrupt relationship between the Ministry of Defence, for example, or American military authorities, and news gatherers. The civilian casualties after certain military raids by the Americans and the UK forces were being actually misrepresented. Sometimes if a rocket was fired into a building, you would see in the actual log that was published by WikiLeaks that 35 people had died in that attack as collateral damage, as civilian casualties. That was reported in the actual contemporaneous log by a military officer. But then when you looked at the news reports, you saw that they'd said 3 had died. And that was happening all the time. And so I thought that was a wonderful contribution. That's just one example that we're doing enormously good work and trying to, and still are in certain quarters, trying to reveal how these relationships are corrupt. And the information is not to be trusted. And the bonds of secrecy are, to some extent, self-serving for those individuals. So that was the good news.
Yeah. And then you were presented with the individual.
And then it becomes not just about an organisation doing good work or struggling to introduce a new idea of honesty, truth and progress into society, but it comes down to a series of individuals. And the main individual, of course, was Julian Assange. I got on very well with him personally at the time. I found him to be quite brave, and he was in a situation of threat at that time. The Americans had declared that they wished to prosecute him under the Espionage Act. There were other much less clear threats to him. There was the Swedish rape allegations,
well,
for example.
Well, what was your position on that? I mean, so you're approaching this man, he's got, on the one hand, he's courageous, he's exposing the US government. On the other hand, several women are accusing him of rape. I mean, and then you're going into his den. How do you feel about that?
Well, I wanted them always to be two separate issues. They are two separate issues. If, as it were, let's just deal in a fictitious possible executive editor at a Boston newspaper, if he or she was accused of rape, and you were making an assessment of their work at the Boston newspaper, they would be two separate things. What's the newspaper doing? What happened in his private life? But Assange himself created a disastrous conflation between the two, in my opinion. And I was with him for really the best part of a year. When he moved out of Ellingham Hall into the embassy, the Ecuadorian embassy, I thought that was a very ethically dodgy move as well, to seek asylum with a nation that has no great record on freedom of expression. But that's a whole other issue. That's where he chose to go. He was there. I used to see him there. And at that point, that conflation I'm talking about between the threat from the Americans to close him down, that's a First Amendment issue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he published the same material that was published by the New York Times and by The Guardian and by Der Spiegel.
Mm.
And if you're going to prosecute Julian Assange, and I'd even say that today, if you're going to prosecute him, you need to prosecute them. And of course, none of them should be prosecuted. They did the work of old-fashioned, truth-telling, campaigning journalism, speaking truth to power. And no matter how unsavoury or how unattractive a defender of liberty Julian Assange or any of them are, I would stick up for the right to do the work that they've been doing. Mm. But you've been asking about this conflation. Suddenly, that need to represent and fight for truth was blended in his account of his situation with the Swedish allegations. Even the other day, saw him appearing in the balcony with his fist raised when the Swedish allegations had been dropped. Now, that was not a victory for liberty. He did not escape from a false accusation. He simply didn't allow himself to be questioned. Now, he might have come onto the balcony and explained that there had been a disastrous misunderstanding. He could have expressed empathy with the two women who felt they had to make that accusation. He could have done a number of things, but to position himself as the victim in that case and conflate it in his description of his situation of being in forced detention. He's not in forced detention. He could walk out today. Mm. And it's a bit like a child who goes la 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 in hopes that that the truth won't penetrate. And that's what I found to be true again and again, is that he was obfuscating and dissembling to such an extent. And if you're writing a book with a person lying to you, and it's a memoir, that's incredibly hazardous. And that's the position I found myself in.
So interesting, because actually the whole book is about lies, different kinds of lies. Lies that you tell yourself, lies that people tell each other, fiction, is it a lie, what kinds of invention. And in that case, you can understand that he has created a paranoid scenario, or at least he's entered a paranoid scenario and perhaps created, exaggerations of that.
I always felt, and I still feel, that for any of us, if there's an accusation of that sort, you have to go and clear your name. That's not just a sort of empty phrase. Clearing your name is a thing. I feel sorry for Julian now because of his own actions and the pressures upon him, some of which have been unnatural. He's put himself in the position of never being able to clear his name on that count. Mm. I told him at the time, regardless of all the threats of extradition, all the threats, and I know that's easy for us to say, but if you're brave, you're brave. Mm. You stand up for what you published and you go and face whatever these terrifying and awful threats are. And if he'd done that, the entire world community of freedom fighters and of people who believed in the First Amendment, the United States, people who believed in freedom of expression, would have come around him and supported him. He would have been the hero of the age in freedom of expression terms. Mm. Instead of which, he's left with this absolutely unanswered series of questions about what happened with the Swedish girls, and he's conflated it with a precarious situation he has in relation to the American threat, and it's never going to be solved unless he individually takes each issue one at a time and deals with them. And at the time I kept saying, appearing in America before these people with their bogus and unconstitutional attempt to take him down or silence him would have made him a great exemplar and a great hero in this area. And I never understood why he didn't do that. Mm.
Yeah, it's interesting that he didn't. Let's talk about lying generally as a sort of, there's an idea that comes up in here about lying as a kind of signature. That you, if you're a writer or if you're a coder, it doesn't really matter. You're kind of writing or doing as only you can, and so, lying is your medium in some way. You also, the Ronnie Pinn story is that, you've invented somebody, he is a lie, you're entering a fiction, it's a non-fiction account, but essentially it's a sort of live version of what you do when you're writing a novel.
Absolutely, and I think as somebody who's spent, all my career now writing fiction and non-fiction, and walking the rather unstable border sometimes between the two. I mean, I've always been interested in the relationship between what is imagined and what is real, or what's fiction and what is journalism. And the relationships between all of them have always been slightly unstable for me, and I've been excited by that. And now I've got to the position where the whole idea of the fictional nature of the times has become a fascinating subject. I mean, you only need to use the words Donald Trump, and you begin to see that the stable relationship that you might wish to assume with reality is quite a big assumption now.
Yeah.
You know, in the era of fake news, in the era of a purported leader of the free world who can use his handheld device to promulgate lies and fictions and false statements and question the number of people who were there in a photographable place watching his inauguration, can actually argue with the photographic evidence from his own, not through public relations, not through the press briefing, not through interviews he might give, but through his own direct contact with an audience of millions. And that is an aspect of the world we're living in, and fiction writers and non-fiction writers might take an interest in that. I can't understand how anybody would find that sort of unremarkable.
Yeah, no, extraordinary. But also, you know, the idea that people withhold information just in daily life, that's a truth, you know, that's a fact, but it's also a fiction, you know.
Yeah.
How about men, this idea of men who are not really men? I mean, you've got Ronnie Pin is not really a man because he literally does not exist. But there's also Craig Wright's oddness. Assange also you felt was sort of possibly on the spectrum. I mean, it must have made you ask, I mean, it's clear that it made you ask what it is that makes us human. I mean, the two real men, so-called, have kind of lost something of their humanity through their circumstances.
I think it's an interesting question, that, because I did ask myself a lot with those particular guys if there wasn't something, you know, alarmingly arrested in each case. And I have to say that so many of the people that I worked with in relation to the cryptocurrency question and in relation to WikiLeaks were either on the spectrum by their own admission, or had some sense of arrested development, that they were stuck in a kind of childhood fantasia about rectitude and about being vindicated. The amazing thing about Assange in particular was that, I mean, his pride was of a childish sort. I mean, he's in the embassy today. I mean, he could come out and he would be taken to Paddington Green Police Station and booked for jumping bail. Booked. That's it. I mean, he wouldn't go to jail for, you know, decades. He probably wouldn't go to jail at all. He would then, after a few days and the paying of a fine, he'd be able to get on a plane and go somewhere. But he, in a sense, he's under conditions of suspended animation that he's addicted to. That there's a fantasy of heroism going on, that I'm under arrest, I'm being silenced, I'm being imprisoned. And he always spoke in that way to me. He hated the idea of conceding to normal circumstances, or in any sense showing weakness. His big obsession was weakness. He would always say to me, if I'd say, you know, well, maybe you were wrong about that, and we can say, there was no question of admitting that I was wrong about that. There was no question of showing, you know, any self-deprecation. I mean, at one point in the story, I say that I tried to give him a crash course in self-deprecation. You know, the idea that you could tell a joke against yourself, it's completely foreign to him. It's a cornerstone of good humour and wit and friendship, that you can take the piss out of your own supposedly, you know, unassailable position. But he wanted the illusion of unassailability, even in his own memoir. I did say to him one day, do you need to make yourself the hero of absolutely every anecdote? Is there any possibility that you were ludicrous? Or, because of course, if you know anything about writing, you know that it's not just a piece of self-advertising or a piece of PR. All great stories involve a certain amount of humorous, you know, failure and self-failure and misapplication and misnaming. You know, there was none of that allowed, and I got the sense very early that whatever those boiling contradictions of his childhood were, they had created an absolute need for international vindication every day. And that's incredible to me.
Yeah.
Fascinating though. But
yeah, no, it's extraordinary. This idea of a ghost, I mean, the first essay is called Ghosting, but also I suppose that Ronnie Pinn is a kind of ghost because he's based on a dead person. I mean, you haven't quite resurrected him because you've invented a new person. The book is partly about the traces we leave behind, or it's possible for a fictional person to leave lots of traces, but for a real person to leave no traces, or Craig Wright wipes out, his digital history or the traces of himself. So it is linked to this idea of memory, I suppose, but it's mainly, it's very specific to the era in which we live now, the idea of technology as memory, or technology as a ghost, or that sort of, that.
When technology has become the ghostifying thing for me, the ghostifying thing, it makes you sort of ghostly. It makes all of us, we're ghosting. I mean, every time you add something on Wikipedia, what are you if not a ghost? You're a ghostwriter. We're all ghostwriters now. And as it happens, I've always believed that novelists and poets are ghostwriters. You're always ghostwriting for somebody. If you're inventing a character and you're writing in the first person, as many novelists do very often, one of the things you are is a ghostwriter.
Because your character is the writer.
Yes, and you're making it for somebody else, and I've always been interested in that relationship. I mean, I know it's got a commercial definition in that people ghostwrite famous people's books. We get that. But the more interesting form of ghostwriting, I think, is the sense of throwing your voice, of haunting houses that you can't live in anymore. Novelists do that all the time. I'm haunted now by the books I've written, as well as having been a ghost. So those notions have always interested me. My first book was called The Missing. I was interested in the disappearance of women. You'll remember, Gaby, that some of the investigations I was doing at that time were about women who were murdered by Fred and Rosemary West in Gloucestershire, and who were never reported as missing. They were ghosts. And the idea that they could have lived in the world and had relationships and gone to schools and had GPs and siblings, but nobody reported them as missing. They just sort of vaporized. And that was a new thing in society, and that was slightly pre-internet, wasn't it? It was just really, it wouldn't be accurate to say it was pre-internet, but it was before the whole world of online normality, if you can call it that, this sort of customary, you wake up in the morning, you turn on your computer. It wasn't like that. And none of that book was, as it were, worked up from Google. There was no search engine then to check street names and addresses and histories and voters' rolls. And I mean, the way that search engines have changed the work that writers do and journalists do is incredible. Because I remember, in order to find out the various addresses that girls had lived at in the 1970s, having to spend months among the electoral rolls, paper electoral rolls at the British Museum, the British Library, as was housed in the old days.
This means it was a round room.
Having to go through them and pour down them. I mean, I think I damaged my eyesight by the age of 26, staring at those paper things. But of course now, 192.com, you pay your money, you got your credits, you'll find anybody's address, not anybody's, but a fair number of them very quickly, and you'll find out where their 3 previous addresses were. It's a different world.
Yeah.
So the books were, these stories in a sense it's continuing material for me, and old topics revived and coming all the way around in middle age to things that interested me as a young man, except the technology has enriched and deepened and estranged those interests of mine.
Yeah, but that's exactly what I was going to ask you about, because there is a point at which you describe Wright as a sort of missing person. There's this line, the complications of being themselves have wiped them out. That actually these people who were so, I mean, we were talking about being on the spectrum, that they are missing in some sense. And so I was interested in how your thoughts about missing persons had evolved through thinking about these people.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it has an absolute direct, almost kind of, there's a kind of mirroring going on between some of those obsessions I had about missing persons. Both, I had them in the book called The Missing, but also had them in the novels. That so many of the characters in the novels earlier were people who had lost sight of their life. They'd lost their selfhood along the way somehow, and now I was able to find out in relation to the Ronnie Pinn story in this book, for example, the middle story that we've been talking about, that when I was in that graveyard and chose that particular dead child's name, I saw that Ronald Pinn had died 20 years old in 1980. When I put the words Ronald Pinn into your engine, no other, the result was precisely nothing. There was nothing. In relation to him, that person who had lived, nothing. There was nothing to bring you to him. There was nothing to tell you about his life. There was no taste expressed. There was no light. There was nothing. There was no memory. By the end of the process of my inventing a Ronald Pinn based on him, there were thousands and thousands of the fake Ronnie Pinns. So the fake Ronnie Pinn's footprint, in a sense, completely outnumbered and outclassed the original, and it told you something about what a life had become. That the original, actual flesh and blood Ronnie Pinn had no footprint in the world beyond, perhaps, in the memory of his mother, who I later found to be still alive and who I end the piece by going to visit. And that's why I included the real Ronnie Pinn, because I wanted the reader to deal with the ethical difficulty, not only of what I'd done in order to tell the story and reproduce what the police had done, but also to think about what it meant to have been a person. Not just that I invented a guy and put him into the dark net and made him buy stuff and drugs and guns and everything else and made him exist in the sense of having a false passport and false driver's license, but also right beside him I was also telling the thin story of an actually existent person. And I wanted that irony to be right at the heart of the reader's mind as they were reading the story.
Yeah, because the question does crop up, of course, of why you needed to do that, why you needed to take a real person, a once real person, or why you couldn't just make up a name, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and that was the thing. I could have made life easy for myself by just inventing a name and a false birth certificate. And I mean, there's all sorts of ways to be a fake person, trust me. But there's the question of building a legend around a sort of real person was a way of sort of, as it were, building up a bank of integrity, as the police called it. You know, that if they said to you, "What school did you go to?" you could say, "Well," and you had it all.
When did you first hear about that practice of the police?
Quite a while ago, just after it was exposed, actually, as having been a common practice in the Met. There was always rumours about it, and a police officer told me back in the 90s that this was happening, and I thought, no. But I always knew that if it ever could be made to emerge, it would tell you an incredible story about the times. And I'm always interested in stories that, as it were, sort of throw light onto the way we live now. I'm sort of fascinated by that. I mean, Facebook admits quite freely, the numbers are probably much higher if they admit it freely, that there are upwards of 78 million fake Facebook accounts. It's an incredible statistic if you think about it. That 78 million people on the planet, at least, have taken the trouble to invent another self. Now, to whatever extent they're using that self, dwelling in that self, embroidering that self, using it to go into chat rooms, using it just as a way of sort of looking in places where they otherwise might be too afraid to go, I don't know, but it's an interesting part of your potential experience now. There was always the double life. We know about Oscar Wilde and the double life, but it was never, as it were, a daily part of your activity in the way that it can be now because of the technology. I think I'll just go and be John for an hour.
Yeah.
I think I'll go and be Susan for 5 minutes. I mean, the technology allows that, and I wanted to swim down into that as far as I could go.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, now, in retrospect, or having done all this work, do you feel that privacy is a right?
I've always felt it, and I feel it more now.
Do you?
At the end, yeah. I mean, I know it's a giant question now, given that it was interesting to see Mark Zuckerberg, who's obviously younger than me, is part of that generation who I think feel that privacy is completely outmoded. That in a sense, the wish for privacy is a kind of misnomer. Why would you wish for privacy unless you were underhanded? I think is Zuckerberg's position, and certainly it was Gawker's position. You know, that every time a privacy was exposed or corrupted, Gawker cheered and thought, that's right, that's one step closer to the reality we want, where nothing is private and nothing is secret. But I, on the other hand, would come in and say that a raid on privacy is a raid on selfhood itself. You know, the idea that there's no respect for the private sphere, a place where your consciousness and its alterations, your arguments with yourself, psychoanalytically, the self's romance, its growth and its backward slides and its your relationship with love and identity, it's not about a public manifestation always. It's about an inward journey. It's about an interiority. I mean, we don't have time today. We could talk about how, and arguably the whole of literary fiction has been an argument about interiority and how alterations in what happens to people inside themselves impact on other people and on the world. I mean, that's Henry James, is it not?
Absolutely.
And if you take that away and you just imagine that if anybody's not telling you something private, it's because they're doing something wrong, then you're playing into the security state in a way that you will rue the day. You know, now that we're in the age of certain television manufacturers, let's just say, having a mechanism called fake off, where your television, when you switch it off, isn't really off. It's still recording and still watching, and that the security agencies can gather that information and use it. Privacy then, including the privacy that can exist between two people, what you say to your girlfriend or your husband or your boyfriend might well be a matter that is all the deeper and all the more enjoyable, to put it at its most basic, because it's private. Because nobody else knows that you feel exactly this at this moment and that you did this. If it's all out there in some Gawker universe, then I think it's a degradation of human experience, I have to say.
Yeah, I feel that even about teenagers saying love you in a text message. But we should probably let you ask some questions if you'd like. And if so, do step up to the David Lynch mic that we have here ready to scramble your speech. We can carry on talking if not.
So can you hear me? Is that all right?
I can, yeah.
Yeah. So just on that point where it seems inevitably we're going to a world where we don't have privacy anymore, what are your thoughts on that? And in your experience with speaking to people like Craig Wright or Julian Assange, what role we're going to play in that, and what role these other powers and these people are going to play in deciding how that turns out?
When you say we, do you mean the general public, or
I'd
do you
say
mean
the
you
general
Google?
public. No,
okay.
I very much mean general public.
Thank you. Well, I think it's going to be one of the big challenges for this generation and for coming generations is trying to find a code of decency and, as it were, a philosophical set of thoughts about how we as human beings exist in relation to our devices. It's going to be a giant new area. I'm not just talking about artificial intelligence. I'm talking about even a relationship with a search engine. What is that engine in our epistemology? What is it in our sense of who we are and how we relate to history and the present in relation to the known and the unknown, in relation to privacy and the told? You know, it's not. I don't think we're more than 10 minutes away from the point where that will be one of the things we do at universities, to try and work out, you know, what a relationship is as individuals with an encoded identity, with a DNA. Is that a paramount thing in the future, or are we all simply part of a neural network where we're hardwired into a neural network where we have a certain force, perhaps a certain brightness? We shine a certain light for a short period and then go out, but we don't actually have a private universe and a narrative that we have sovereignty over. The question of sovereignty of self in the age of the internet will be, I think, one of the great challenges for writers, thinkers, practitioners, individuals, technologists, the day after tomorrow. As for those individuals that you mentioned that I've worked with, they will be remembered as people who made a contribution to this, I'm sure. You know, one of the reasons I was so drawn to sticking with them, even through sometimes quite harrowing circumstances, was because I really believed that they were important factors in that debate that I've described as both coming and happening. That they would they wouldn't be victorious necessarily. Neither of those men, at least up till today, are having a triumphant time. You know, Craig Wright, in the end, failed to consolidate his position as Satoshi Nakamoto. He failed his own paternity test in public. Although I personally always believed that he was certainly there at the foundation of Bitcoin, and his attachment to the technology, his attachment to the timeline, and his being in possession of the codes was just, it was too much evidence. So, but the mask had, as it were, eaten so deeply into his face that he couldn't take it off, is one way of putting it. The Satoshi mask, and not just into his face, but I presume into others that he worked with on that original software. Assange is a different story, you know, but he too will be an important figure, I think, when we come to look at what is the relationship between an individual and the state. That will be, just as we talk of John Wilkes, I think, is somebody who opened up the question of what was liberty. And we're still asking, what is liberty? But you need to ask the question every day, because the meaning changes every day in relation to what's in front of us. And what's in front of us at the moment is a series of powers within the machines that will change the whole nature of the law, to say nothing of morality. So I think we're in for exciting times, but we're in the foothills at the moment. I mean, we don't even have a generally agreed code of decency for the internet at the moment. And that sounds like the beginnings of an argument for censorship, and it's not. I mean, I'm not into censoring films or censoring television, but I generally believe in the board of certification, and I generally believe in the watershed. Because I've got a 13-year-old and I don't want her to be frightened going to bed. Doesn't mean I want censorship. You know, it's the same with the internet. We need to get a bit sophisticated, I think, in our politics about it. Because it's a bit kind of, you're either for everything or you're for censorship. And there's got to be something, there's so much thinking to be done. It's not going to be done by me, clearly. It's done by people cleverer than I am, but I hope it will be done.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Is there another question?
You mentioned how you invented an individual based on this young man that had died before. How did you approach the ethical questions around this? Does this young man have some kind of right of privacy after his death, and are you altering his memory without him being able to consent?
That's an interesting core question about that story for me. Believe me, I was well aware of it at the time. And you don't go into writing a story like that blind. I mean, in a sense, the story is about that question. And I believe as a writer, your job isn't to just solve all the maths and tell the reader how clever you are as a mathematician, morally or otherwise. Your job is just to provide the arithmetic in the right way and in the right order and walk away. And I believe that there was only one way to tell that story of the ethical nightmare of stealing dead children's names and creating false identities, as our police force was doing. The only way to tell that was to do it, to really get inside how they did it, and what it meant, and did it have an effect, to go back to your question, on one's sense of the real person. Another question that comes with it is, do we own the story of our own lives? Do you own your story? Do you, Gaby, own yours? Does anybody in the audience or watching actually have ownership rights on what happens to them? Because you might say it doesn't really belong to oneself at all. It belongs to the world. Where I was born and what happened and what I did and what was did to me, is it a possession of mine? Is the story of my children my possession? I know we behave as if it is, as if it's a corruption of some personal ownership, but ultimately it belongs to history and it belongs to the world and it belongs to writing. That's my argument. But there's a more popular, I think, ethical position, which is that Ronnie Pinn's mother, as it were, owns his memory now, and that it was a corruption of his memory to take him and attach his details to somebody else. Again, I would argue that I wanted the reader to go on asking themselves about that ethical difficulty long after the story was finished. My job, in a sense, would be done if that happened. For my own part, I certainly felt it was important to tell the actual story of the true Ronnie Pin as part of my story, so as not to dodge the bullet, but to actually say, and in a sense, your question suggests that I might have taken him away from reality. I think I gave him a reality that he didn't have by recording him finally, because now the real Ronnie Pin's story is actually part of what we can say about that young man who lived and died in 1980. But I agree with you, it's an ethical conundrum. That's why I wrote it. A lot of stories are.
Thanks.
On my way to office, I was listening to Malcolm Gladwell's the recent podcast. So he is explaining about a CIA informant and how and asked the ethical question of one side we have the need to know, and the other side there is personal safety. I mean, when you go into the secret lives, you are going to get entangled into the very serious stuff, espionage, national security, and things like that. Do you have an experience of that kind? Or in that cases, how do you might have to withhold some information from the public? Or do you decide that? From your discussion about the WikiLeaks, I felt that you wanted to have more information given to the public. So
well, that is actually, thank you for that question. It was actually core to the whole WikiLeaks experience over the war logs, was that WikiLeaks were very keen to dump that material onto the internet pretty fast, and indeed they did. There was a question from some quarters, including some of the publishing partners, The Guardian and so on, about whether the material should be redacted before appearing in public. And there's a strong argument for redaction in that case, as implicit in your question, because sometimes informants will be named, and you might be condemning them to death, actually, by just dumping that material straight onto the net. That was a strong argument in the WikiLeaks case. Now, they resisted it, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with good argument, but it was debatable. But from my perspective, redaction would always be necessary. Redaction is a sort of an incendiary word. Again, it's like censorship. You're not censoring something because you can't face the truth. You're editing it so as to protect the innocent. And we do that every day in writing. We do it every day in journalism. We do it every day in software production. You don't have such a respect for the truth, as if the truth is sort of this sort of clear flowing river of excellence. It's a muddy thing, full of branches and roots and made up stuff and old prams and stuff that was never true, but people think it's true. I mean, the truth is a capacious mess of a thing. And so the idea of just dumping the truth on the internet is always going to be questionable to me. I believe in editing, I believe in publishing, I believe in the judgments that come with selection, with scholarship, and I was always trying to push WikiLeaks towards scholarship, towards the publisher Verso, and to proper academics taking the material from each region and spending years filtering, collating, examining, annotating, because that is a thing. That's a whole industry, and it matters in human life to carefully, even as journalists, to carefully, with a legal eye and also with an eye for protecting individuals, even if they don't hold your political views, perhaps even especially if they don't hold your political views, you must protect them against savagery that might come their way from your careless exposure of them. That was a big issue, and it continues to be a big issue when you're dealing with secret information, or formerly secret information. It was there, we won't go into it today, but it was there in the Edward Snowden case with the NSA. He was altogether much more cognizant, I think, of the problems and the deeper issues to do with safety and security. I think it's naive and childish just to suggest that all security is bogus. I want to say grow up to those people. There are threats against us. There are lunatics in the world, and there are people with strong political arguments who behave like lunatics as well. But we must defend ourselves against them and protect our children, our people. If And that will involve a certain amount of secrecy and sharing of information in a careful way. It doesn't make one a right-winger to recognise that. I think it should be recognised. At the same time, I'm all for breaking down those false and corrupt links that can exist between governments, money individuals and ideologues and so on, which is what WikiLeaks started by doing. Thank you.
Good question, thank you. Is there another one? We have a bit more time if you want. If not, actually, I want to ask you something about your own position in all of this, because you, at one point you say that pleasing people is a vice and a virtue. I can't remember which way around. A virtue as a man and a vice as a journalist, or the other way around? The other way around.
Yeah.
And there's another point at which someone wants a cigar, it must be Assange, and you give it to him. There's just one line like that. He wanted a cigar and I gave him one. I thought, wow, he's got cigars just lying around his house. This is a perfect, who knew that this was the job of a reporter?
Just keep a stash just in case, you never know when the Castros might arrive at the door wanting a cup of tea and a cigar.
Exactly. So, I mean, how do you feel, how do you position yourself, or what are your concerns about reporting on some of this tricky material as a sort of voyeur, or whatever you want to call yourself?
I think that the reporter is always, should always, at least in my book, be ready to sort of put themselves through the mill a bit. I mean,
in what way?
Well, it doesn't mean necessarily be down in your elbows under the barbed wire, sort of, at the war front, but it sometimes does mean that. It means putting yourself at risk to get the truth. It means exposing yourself to a certain amount of psychological difficulty. It means walking in the rain. It means, walking away from your comforts. It means not sitting at home working on your novel, but actually, which is an important activity if you're a novelist. But sometimes putting on your sneakers and going out into inclement situations in order to know what's happening, in order to bring back the moral news to your desk. I just think it's worth it. It's sometimes got to be done. But I don't think that the writer in that situation should set him or herself up, as it were, as the morally resplendent person. You sometimes see essayists and writers who think of themselves that way. Good luck to them. Maybe they are morally resplendent in every way. I never thought that was the writer's job. I believe the Janet Malcolm position, as expressed in The Journalist and the Murderer, a famous piece for The New Yorker, where she realised that there is a sort of it's almost like an acting job sometimes being a writer. Each one requires you to sort of to take a position in the room. Quite often you fade into the wallpaper, and that's a performance too, if you're quite vivacious and quite like people and you're quite sociable. Sometimes just not speaking is a performance. And that's what I meant when I said pleasing people can be a vice and a virtue. But sometimes I'm just focusing on the reader being my friend, not the people in the room being my friend. I don't owe a debt of friendship to any of the subjects in this book. I mean, I might have felt some residual friendship for them and some loyalty, actually. They might not see it that way, but there was a lot. It took me a long time to write these stories, and I held much out of the frame because it was irrelevant to my purpose. So there was loyalty, and continually so, I think. But what there is this sense that you have to do the job for the reader. And Joseph Mitchell, that great other New Yorker writer, taught us that you just have to disappear slightly into the miasma of the thing that's difficult to describe and somehow let it happen to you too.
Yeah, it's a nice idea. The two things that Craig Wright asked you not to say about his personal life, you withheld them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I did. And again, there are the great warriors for truth who will say, why did you compromise by not mentioning them? But it was a bit like our friend's question before about security. Those two individual points that he asked me to hold back on, had I not held back on them, could have resulted in harm to two sets of individuals. And I made a very straight and clear in my mind decision to leave out that material. It was good material too.
Well, so supposing he didn't realise it would have caused harm and he didn't ask you to withhold it, but you realised that they would have caused harm and you decided, would you then have decided to withhold those things?
Very interesting that. I mean, I probably would have on one of the two. I'm sorry this is so tantalising.
Yes, what is it?
We were on camera. But the problem was that I would have made a judgment in favour of withholding on one of those counts because it involved, shall we say, people more than averagely innocent, young people.
Okay.
In the other case, I probably would have gone ahead and told that part of the story because I felt it was a part of the story. But it would possibly have exposed that person to serious doubts about themselves and danger. They might have been a danger to themselves, and I just couldn't take that risk. No piece of journalism is worth the loss of life, I don't think. And I certainly wasn't going to be taking that risk.
It's just a question of whether all journalists are aware of that as they go on. In fact, Janet Malcolm, I once interviewed Janet Malcolm and I asked her whether she ever felt she had to protect people from themselves, whether they were telling her too much and she wanted to leave that out. And she looked at me and I said, I was completely mad.
Well, there are moments sometimes when you're sitting with a person, sometimes you've been working with them for months and they start to speak and something inside you cringes. The tape recorder's on, there's a notepad on your lap, and they're saying something so damaging to themselves that you do think, because you know that it's not your responsibility to censor them, to stop them from being who they are. That would be false in terms of what journalism is. And yet you're human, you have a relationship with them, and they can't hear how that sounds.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And Janet Malcolm would tell you, she might delight in such moments, but she's probably tougher than most. But sometimes you delight in it because they're awful, and you think you're now hanging, drawing, and quartering yourself, as I knew you were capable of doing. But in other cases, you think, no, you simply are tin-eared when it comes to how you are coming across. And that thing I was telling you about before, about people having no ear for self-deprecation, no willingness to see themselves in a comic way. And after many, many months of that, the reader, because you become an intelligencer for the reader as a writer. You're a kind of forward scout for their interpretation sometimes. And as a forward scout, you're seeing it coming sometimes and thinking, wow, he's really going to say that on tape. And yeah, it happens.
In that sense, it's a bit like editing, though, because, and you're a great editor, where you're trying to imagine how the reader will take this, or you're saying to the writer or the speaker, is that really what you want to say?
Yeah, and sometimes your job, non-controversially, if you like, is to simply help the person round to the place where they can be clear about what they're saying and what they did and why and who was involved and what time. And, not everybody's a born storyteller. Some people give an awful account of themselves, just awful. They give a very poor eyewitness account of what their life's been like. Most people. If you asked most husbands to give an account of what they'd been like what they have been like as a husband, they'd give a terribly self-satisfied, one-sided account of what it had been like.
Well, that's because there are risks involved in describing it differently.
I'm sure, but self-knowledge isn't a given, and neither is, even if you have self-knowledge, neither is the ability to then put that into sentences. And so we're just talking about interviewing here.
Yeah.
The idea that you interview a human being and they immediately come flowing with beautiful sentences that are totally accurate and legally secure is not the case. People self-invent, they lie, they cut corners, they edit, they obfuscate, they dissemble, they can't face it, they wish they hadn't come, But your job is to try and swim through that and find something true and coherent and hopefully entertaining as well.
That's a great result. I think we're going to end there. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for watching, and thank you, especially Andy, for speaking to us.
Thanks, Gaby. Thank you.